any further. There we are, that's recording. And we'll make a start. So just a few pieces of information before we get started. As I've just mentioned, we are going to record today's session, so that's now recording. Any questions you have throughout today's webinar, you will see at the bottom of your screen, if you hover with the cursor, an icon with Q&A with 2 speech bubbles in it. That's the question and answer chat facility. So if you have any questions at all today, if you could pop it in the Q&A, that would be really helpful, so we can distinguish any feedback comments that are in the chat from questions and identify them easily. I won't be answering them sort of bit by bit throughout the webinar, but rather we will finish up slightly early so that we have 10 minutes or so to dedicate to questions at the end. So if anything isn't clear, or if you'd like more information or specific queries that you've had from, you know, developing your own teaching materials or using our materials, then please feel free to put your questions in the chat, in the Q&A chat. And then we'll make today's recordings together with the recordings of all the other webinars available after the 9th of October. So tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we have the last 2 webinars in this series, which Bartek will be kindly delivering for us. One is based on how to help students deal with stress when they're preparing for exams, and the other one is related towards developing growth mindset in young learners. So that's what's to come tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and we will then make the recordings available from the 9th, together with an online goodie bag of resources that you can download and use for helping prepare your students. So what are we going to look at today? Well, we'll start with an exam overview, as we have done throughout the 4 skill webinars that have taken place over the past week. That's just a quick overview for those of you who are maybe joining today for the first time, so that you can see how the written tasks fit into the rest of the PTE Young Learner exam tasks. And then we will look at the writing tasks across the 4 different levels of exams, and these vary in type and in number indeed, and in the points that they give to the students depending on the level of exam the students are taking. So we'll do a deep dive into that. At the same time, we'll look at how those activities are assessed, so what the examiners are looking out for. And then probably more importantly, we're looking at how we can help prepare our students. So some suggestions for tips and activities that you can use with your students. And then we'll round up with a look at the resources that are available and any questions that you may have at the end. So let's get started with the exam overview. And for those of you who've already seen the listening, reading and speaking webinars, this slide will be familiar to you. And in particular, because when Camille, who did the webinar on reading last week, looked at the tasks in activity 3 and 5 in particular, there is reading involved in those activities as well as writing. So to a degree, some of the information on these tasks has been looked at already, but we're looking at it from the writing skills point of view this afternoon. So you'll see at the first words level, there's just one writing activity, and that is a gap fill activity. That's a sort of a soft entry, if you like, in the first level for students having to cope with doing a written task. And in essence, that gap fill is an activity where students already have the words to choose from, and they need to choose which ones are the correct ones from a larger number of words than there are gaps to fill, but we'll look at that in a moment. Then we'll move on to Springboard, where students have a dialogue completion activity that will require them to be able to read and understand the dialogue, to be able to then write and complete the questions in the dialogue. That then is followed by a gap fill activity and a writing sentences activity. At Quick March, they also have the dialogue completion activity, but whereas with Springboard, the questions that need to be completed have been started, so students are writing questions from prompts. In the Quick March level and in the breakthrough level, those question prompts aren't there, they just need to write the questions from scratch. The gap fill activities also change as students move up the level, so there are fewer options to choose from in terms of the correct words in the Quick March, and at Breakthrough, students complete a gap fill, but they need to do that by putting their own words in, so no words are supplied. And then the final task at Quick March is writing sentences. And the final task in Breakthrough is to write a short narrative, a short story. Let's have a look then at the points that are available for students. Whoops, I think that's for some reason stopped sharing my screen. Let's just go back a second. There we go. Okay. So let's have a look a second at the points that are available to students then across these different tasks. So in the first words exam, the writing task is worth 14, and that's 14 points out of 100 points that are available. So the writing doesn't have maybe as large a portion of points dedicated to it as the other skills. In Springboard, those points become more significant. So in Springboard, you've got 15 points available for the dialogue completion, the gap fill, and the writing sentences. Although bear in mind that with the dialogue completion and the gap fill, that reading is also being tested in those activities as well. Similarly, in Quick March and in Breakthrough, the dialogue completion is testing reading skills as well as writing skills. And the answering questions at the end of Quick March, which is worth 10 points, is a different task than when you move on to Breakthrough, where you have the short story, the short narrative to be written, which is worth 20 points. So you see, as you go up the levels, the points available for writing become more significant, if you like. There are more points available for the writing activities. Let's start then with first words. And as I mentioned, there's only one writing task in first words. And the test takers a short text like the one you see here, which is taken from a past paper. The context of this short text includes members of the Brown family and the immediate people that they come into contact with. So although the text in itself will be unfamiliar to students because it'll be the first time that they're seeing it, the people involved or the references and certainly the topic areas that are covered are all things that are found in the syllabus. So test takers then, they read this short text with the gaps and they choose a word for each of the gaps from the choices given in the box below. So they have a choice of words, there are some additional words, and they need to choose which ones fit into the 7 gaps that are available. These 7 gaps then are scored either as correct or incorrect. And as you can see, from 7 gaps, then there are 14 points. So 2 points per question. No partial score on this, it's either correct or incorrect. What this is designed to assess then as an activity is to test their reading and writing skills and their ability to understand a short text by inserting the correct word into the gap. These are the topics and the lexical areas that the students could find a text based on. So the one we've just looked at talked about school. You can see that's one of the topics for first words. vocabulary areas there as well. In the test guides, which we will look at the end, there's also an actual vocabulary list as well, like a glossary, so you know exactly which words could come up. And then these are the grammar structures for the first words area. So they'll all come from areas either including the topics or the vocabulary areas we've just looked at, and will include grammatical structures as listed on this slide here. And this is also taken from the first words guide. So you will find all of that in the guide, which I will share with you at the end. In terms of tips for this activity, it's important that students really take the time to read both the text and the words in the box really carefully, and that they don't rush. I've invigilated regularly over the years with the young learner exams, and typically young learners as first words can often be their first encounter with formal certification. They do tend to rush, and they tend to finish with maybe even 20 minutes, 25 minutes of the exam still to go. The exam is obviously designed to allow students enough time to do things calmly. And so it's important as teachers that we try and instill that sense of not rushing through the activities in them. And I think particularly because writing comes as the last task, it may be that their concentration at that point you know, is coming to an end, if in a sense, with young learners. So I think it's really important that they do take the time to do this, and they don't just sort of rush through it really quickly and then maybe mix up which words they wanted to put in the gaps. So it'll also really help them to think about what words they need to ensure that the text makes sense. So before even looking at the box below with the options in there, that they read through that text and think about what word is missing, and to think whether they need a noun or whether they need an adjective or a pronoun, and to really train them to be familiar with those classifications, if you like, of words, so that they really think about what comes before and what comes after, and therefore what is missing and what needs to go there to make sense of the text that they're reading. It's also helpful for them to think about which words in the box they don't need as well. So it may be a kind of a trial and error, but that's the beauty of having plenty of time to do it, and to do it calmly, is that they actually consider the options that are there for them. So in one way or another, the answer is there. They're just having to select it. And this is where what I referred to in the introductory webinar I did last Monday about putting those critical thinking and choosing skills into place. So one way to help students get familiar with what words are going to come up, or what types of words are going to come up in this gap fill activity, is to get them familiar with classifying words. And this is an activity you can do very, very easily by creating a table like the one I've put on the slide here, and giving them a word list and get them to put the words on the list into the right category. So I've given some examples here using the grammatical structures, the lexical areas, if you like, the vocabulary from the first words syllabus guide, just to give you an idea. So you just start to get them to think about different types of words, and not just gap fill, meaning putting words in the gap, yes, but what kinds of words, so they think about it more critically, and hopefully then are helped to make the correct decision. Another activity you can do is to do sentence reordering. So you can give them the sentences from the gap text with the correct words in there, but get them to look at these sentences in a mixed up order and ask them to reorder it. So this is an activity where you're then developing your, let's say, your attention in terms of paying attention to word order and making sense of a series of words one after the other. So in that way, students really sort of think about the order of the words as they appear in the sentence, and then that hopefully will train them to understand and to pick out quickly and easily the missing words that are in the box below. You may want to start with giving them past papers where you've deleted or used correction fluid to delete the additional words in the text. This can help in the short term, maybe, to get them not just familiar with the task, but to reduce the amount of choice that they have to make, and then just gradually build up with having additional words or distractors in there. But if, you know, everything that's in the box is going to fit in one way or another, that could be maybe a softer approach to getting them familiar with doing this test. It's just a suggestion, and a lot will also depend on the age at which students do these exams. We have students who take first words as young as 6 years of age. Most students take it at 9 or 10 years of age, and as you can imagine, there's a very large, you know, gap between students' experience of even being in school between 6 and 9/10. So that's your judgment to make in terms of what you think is most appropriate. Moving on then to Springboard, and in Springboard we have 3 different types of writing task, although some of them are also testing reading as well, as I mentioned. The first one then is dialogue completion. So students will have a dialogue like the one you see on the screen here, and they are required to complete the sentences that have been started for them. So, complete the questions that have been started from them. So this is a dialogue which gives answers to questions, and it gives question prompts, but it's up to the student to take that question prompt and complete the question so that the answer that follows makes sense, and the whole dialogue then unfolds and makes sense, where one question is asking the question to the answer that's already there. Again, you will see members of the Brown family, so there will be something that's familiar about the context of the dialogue. And they have 5 questions to complete. Each one is worth a maximum of 3 points. There are partial scores available for this activity. So 3 points will be given when a student's response is completely correct, so grammatically correct, correct spelling, appropriate punctuation, and relevant to the context. So the question is a question that's relevant to the answer that follows it. For 2 points, the response can include a major error. There's some examples of what those major errors could be, but the major errors should not affect the meaning intended by the test taker, and it shouldn't represent a huge amount of effort on the part of the examiner to understand what the test taker intended. So there may be small spelling errors or small punctuation errors, but not intrusive to the degree that the examiner really struggles to understand what the candidate meant. For 1 point, there may be a variety of errors in the answer, but the context of the task and the meaning can still be understood, albeit with some effort on the part of the examiner. So the sliding scale from 3 down to 2 down to 1, you see the number of errors increasing and the importance of the errors in terms of impeding understanding increase as the scores drop. And then finally, a 0 score is either that the response is irrelevant or nothing has been written. And as Camille mentioned last week, It's really important that we train students to have the confidence to try, even when they're not sure, because for certain they may pick up some points if they try and get it right, or even if they get it partially correct. But if they don't write anything, then the examiner's got nothing to correct, so they will score a 0. The next task in Springboard is the gap fill activity, and we've moved up now from 7 points to seven sentences to be completed, or 7 gaps to be filled rather, to 10 gaps to be filled. Still given an example as you were with first words, and students still need to choose the missing word from the choices given. And as there are 10 gaps to be completed and 15 points to be gained, there are a maximum of 1.5 points per correct answer. And again, their answer is either correct or it's incorrect. Task 6 in Springboard is very different than, whereas task 6 in first words was the gap fill. This time students need to respond to 5 questions. Short responses, they don't need to be really long responses, and there's a total of 10 points available. And again, the response is either completely correct for 2 points, appropriate and relevant to the context, so correct grammar, correct spelling, and appropriate as an answer to the question that's being asked. Or they could get a partial score where the response is maybe inaccurate in form, but in the context of the task, the meaning can still be understood with some effort. And as you can see, students are required to write about 30 words overall for this task. So when you consider that there are 5 questions to be answered, then that gives you an idea of how much is expected in terms of short answers. Okay. In terms of what is being assessed in these activities, with the dialogue completion, we are assessing students' understanding of the structural relationship between questions and responses, and their ability to complete questions to given responses within a single dialogue. So they have the prompts to get them started. They need to understand the structural relationship between a question and the answer that's already given, and that they're then able to complete a dialogue that makes sense. With the gap fill then, we're assessing the ability to understand a text and their knowledge of vocabulary and grammar in context, within the context of that text, and what it's based around. Answering questions task then is to assess the ability to write about a familiar topic based on a scenario from within the test. So something about that scenario will be familiar to them, and the scenario in which the questions are based relate to the topic areas that are in the syllabus. So lexical areas and areas of language use for Springboard. You see them here again, as I mentioned. I'll refer you to the guides where you can find all this detail at the end. And here you have the topic areas. One thing to mention about the topic areas and vocabulary lexical areas and the grammatical structures and the language being used is that first words is the basis upon which everything else is built. So the way PTE Young Learner exams work is that we expect students who are taking Springboard to already be familiar with the topics and the vocabulary and the grammatical structures of first words, and so on and so forth. So when you move on to Quick March, we take for granted that you already know the topic areas, the vocabulary and the grammatical structures of Springboard and of first words, and so on and so forth. In terms of tips then for this activity, students need to know obviously grammar and vocabulary to do this activity. They need to read the instructions carefully to understand what words they need to complete the questions. It's a very obvious thing to say read the instructions, but it's amazing how many students just dive into the task without actually paying attention to the instructions themselves. And they should really revise the who, when, where, how and why question forms, as well as closed question formats as well. They should be aware of adverbs of frequency and the order of words in sentences as well. And all these suggestions that I'm sharing with you come from Pearson's top tips for preparing students for First Word, Springboard, Quick March and Breakthrough. So at the end, I'll show you the title that I'm referring to, but you will find preparation activities that take into account the tips that I'm sharing with you here. In this activity in particular, for example, we really suggest that students get in the habit of underlining keywords in the instructions. So it's really clear to them what to do. And remember, they will always have an example. For the gap fill, it's important here that they read, as I mentioned before, both the text and the words in the box carefully and don't rush. It'll help them to think about what words they need to ensure the text makes sense. And they can do that initially, maybe without even relying on the words in the box, but to really think about what is missing. And as I mentioned before, think about whether it's a noun, a verb, an adjective, a pronoun, so that they then, when they go to make their choice, they're looking for the right kind of word in the box. And as they have extra words in the box, then to think about what they don't need. In terms of tips for preparing the answers to questions, so they're given a series of questions. As you remember, they need to write a total of around 30 words across 5 answers to 5 different questions. I would suggest starting with a control task where you actually give them options to answer the questions. So they start to build up answers to questions. And that way you're really scaffolding an approach for them by, first of all, giving them some answers to work with and to formulate the answers with given answers, given options, if you like. And once they become familiar with choosing options in answer to a question, they can maybe start to then build a mind map of answers to questions. So you could take one of the topic areas or one of the lexical sets and think about what questions could come up about that area and start to build out answers, students' personal answers to a question around a topic area. And as they become more familiar with doing that, then the method of working on the mind maps should build confidence so that they can always think of an answer to the questions that they find in the exam. Moving on then to Quick March, which is the 3rd level. Again, three tasks. Here the dialogue completion has evolved from what it was at Springboard. So whereas at Springboard level, students had to write the questions using the question prompt, now it's completely up to them to formulate the question. So there are no prompts at this stage. The only prompt they have to rely on are the answers to the questions they need to formulate. So they need to pay particular attention to the answers in order to be able to formulate the questions. Again, they're given an example so they can see the format of what is expected of them. And again, you have a sliding scale of points that you can achieve depending on how accurate the answer is. So again, a total number of 5 questions to be formulated, 15 marks available, and students can get a maximum of 3 points per question, but they can get a partial score if, for example, there are some errors, or there's a little bit more effort required on the part of the examiner to understand what they meant. But certainly better to write something than to leave it completely blank because the student is unsure. It's always best to try and write something. In the gap fill activity, again, there are 10 points, 10 gaps to be filled. Again, as with Springboard, you've got a total of 1.5 points per question. So it's a similar approach. Students are advised to read the text as a whole first without looking at the words in the box below, to underline the keywords in the instructions, so it's key. You see on this one, it says don't forget to change them into the past tense. So Anna writes to Granny about her day in town, fill in the missing words, use the verbs in the box below, but don't forget to change them into the past tense because the visit to town is finished. So it's not enough just to take the verbs that you see in the box below, they need to put them into the past tense. So we're testing past tense in this activity. And then you have the completing sentence activity. So rather than answering a question, students are now required to use the prompt they see at the beginning of each sentence and to complete the start of that sentence. There are 5 sentences to be completed, and they're required to write around 50 words, so about 10 words in each sentence completion sentence. Again, there's a possibility of getting partial scores here. So a student whose response is completely correct, appropriate and relevant can get a maximum of 2 points. If there are inaccuracies in the form, but the context and meaning of what is written means that what has been written is still easy to understand, then the candidate could get still get 1 point. If there is no response written, then the candidate won't get a score point. In terms of what we're focusing on here, then with the dialogue completion, we're looking at candidates' ability to not just understand the relationship between questions and responses, but also to write questions to given responses. So no prompts this time, the question needs to be written out in full. In the gap fill, we're looking at their knowledge of vocabulary and context, but more importantly, maybe their familiarity with past tense forms. And then with the completing of the sentences, to look at their ability to write about a familiar topic from a prompt based on a scenario within the test. So still using the Brown family as a context. Here you have the areas of language use and main structures for the quick march level, and the topics and the vocabulary. Our test tips then, particularly for the dialogue completion and the gapped text, is really to build on the strategies we discussed for the Springboard. So obviously you need to take into consideration new grammatical areas, topics and lexical sets, because the syllabus is building on new information from that point of view. But the approach in terms of taking a scaffolded approach and to build familiarity with question forms, both the when, where, what, why, how questions, but also the questions with auxiliaries, then Building up that familiarity will certainly give students confidence to be able to write questions from scratch. So by identifying the way in which the answer and the word order of the answer, then that will invite them to create a certain type of question rather than another. For the gap fill, then the importance on familiarity with verbs in the past tense is obviously an important one to focus on. In terms of the task 6, although this varies from just answering questions, so now you're writing sentences, I think working on mind maps is still a valid tool here, particularly if you're building up their ability to write things about certain topic areas using certain lexical sets and grammar structures. So the mind map is always a useful tool because it helps students visualize what they're going to write. Finishing up then with the breakthrough task, the breakthrough tasks rather. So again, 3 tasks that involve writing, and as with the quick march, in this activity 3, you have the dialogue completion, where students again are required to complete the dialogue by formulating complete questions. You have the same approach to full scoring and partial scoring as you've seen across the other levels, where the dialogue completion comes in. And as with the other levels, there's a total of 15 marks to be gained, and a sliding score of points depending on the accuracy and the appropriacy of what students have written. In the gap fill in breakthrough, there's no longer a box. So in this activity, you see here, Ben emails a friend. The next day, Ben writes an email to his friend, Christoph. Fill in the gaps using one word in each gap. The first one is an example. So students no longer have a choice of words to rely on, but rather they move to a linguistic task this time where they're producing something themselves. So it's really looking at their ability to look at what went before and what comes after, and choose an appropriate word that ensures that the text, when you read it through, makes sense. And as with the other gap fill activities, the answers are either correct or incorrect, and there's 1 point for each gap to be filled. Final task then is the most open task that we have in the young learner writing activities. This is worth 20 points, and here candidates are required to write a short narrative, a short story, using the series of picture prompts that are given to them. They are to write around 75 words, and all 6 pictures need to be included in the story. So they are advised as test takers to try and divide the number of words as evenly as possible between one picture and another. It's also important to consider what might happen between one picture and another in order to link it into a story. But having said that, it's not vital that the story is hugely interesting. It's important that it reflects what's happening in the picture, and there's a logical sense that through the text that the student is following what happens between one picture and another. If students respond at 25% lower than the word count suggested, so if it's 75 words, the word count suggested, a maximum of 3 marks per scoring criteria will be awarded. And we'll have a look at the scoring criteria in a moment because it's quite detailed. And if the response to the task is completely off subject, then a mark of 0 will be awarded for task completion, and a maximum of 2 marks for the other criteria. So responses are not penalised if they're over the word limit. Obviously, try and keep that within reason. But if candidates do go slightly over, then that's not an issue. So in terms of what's been assessed for the dialogue completion and the gap fill, again, we have similar criteria to what we've seen already. I wanted to spend a minute or two on the criteria for the short story, the short narrative, because here students can get a maximum of 20 points, and there are 4 areas that the examiner is looking at. So they're looking for effective communication, and that the writing creates an overall impression of excellence, and the errors that are there are insignificant. So it's clear what is being communicated, and that there's, as a result, an excellent range of accurate use of vocabulary, an excellent range and an accurate use of grammar, and a scenario that is fully exploited and developed, therefore an excellent response to the task. So the candidate is including all 6 of the vignettes that are shown there, all 6 of the pictures that are shown there, and that there's a sense of linking information between what's happening in one picture and the next. Here we have the areas of language use and main structures, and the vocabulary seems to have dropped off for some reason. I'll ensure that when we share the slides with you, that's back in. I'm not sure what's happened there. In terms of the task tips then, for the tasks 3 and 5, we suggest that you follow the tips that we've already discussed for the lower levels, but do remember that task 5 at breakthrough level requires students to put in their own words, not take words from the box. From the task 6 perspective, apart from reading the instructions carefully, which we advise for all the tasks, but it's important to identify what the main event is in each of the pictures. So candidates are really clear what the main thing is that's happening in that picture, and therefore what they should be writing about. And then, as I mentioned, think about what happens between one picture and another as a way to link the description of what they see in one picture and another. Important that they check grammar, vocabulary, spelling, and punctuation at the end of completing their task, and they don't just leave it as is, but they take the time to reread it and make any necessary corrections. And bear in mind that it's important to do a past simple, past continuous review for this task for students. In terms of resources, we have the guides, and these are available at all levels of the Young Learner exams. We'll share these with you in the online goodie bag at the end of the webinars this week. In here you will find everything to do with the test format. You will find all the information about how the activities are scored, exactly what is being assessed, and suggestions, as well as the grammar and vocabulary and lexical areas and topics. We have past papers on the website. The past papers are both in PDF format that can be printed. We also have a range of them that are editable, so you can send them as PDFs for your students to complete digitally. We have a newly published course series called Team Together, which is benchmarked to the 4 levels of the Young Learner exams. And we have the practice test books, the top tips for First Words and Springboard, and Benchmark and Breakthrough. And most of the suggestions that I've made throughout this webinar dedicated to preparing writing have come from this book here. So you'll find additional practice activities in there to ensure students are thoroughly prepared for the exam. On the Pearson English portal, if you've adopted Team Together, you will also have access to a series of online resources as well. And within those online resources, you will also find PTE Young Learner practice papers. This is my email address. Should you like to contact me for anything, any further information in relation to the Young Learner exams. And I'll stop there and check if we have any questions. If you want to ask a question and you haven't yet written a question, feel free to do so. So I'm just going to check. Okay, the chat, I can't see anything. Let me just also check the question and answers. Okay, nothing in there. Well, I'll wait a minute or so if anybody has any questions. I would also be interested to know whether you have any particular feedback on preparing the young learners, and anything in particular you wanted to give us in terms of feedback, or ask you know, any questions about the preparation of students, then feel free to do that. Okay, I can't see any questions. So if we don't have any questions, then I'll wrap up today's webinar here. Please join us tomorrow at, let me just come out of my main screen. Okay, please join us tomorrow when my colleague Bartek will be running tomorrow's webinars at 10 and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon as well, if it's more convenient for you to join in the afternoon. And tomorrow, Bartek will be covering how to manage stress with preparing students for young learner exams. Thank you very much.